Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Angell. I am an adjunct reference librarian at the CUNY Graduate Center and the coordinator of library instruction at LIU Brooklyn.
My name is Elvis Bakaitis. I'm the interim head of reference at the CUNY Graduate Center. Happy to be here today, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Jill Cirasella, and I'm the Associate Librarian for Scholarly Communication and Digital Scholarship at the CUNY Graduate Center.
Hi, I'm Adriana Palmer. I'm the Electronic Resources Librarian at CUNY Graduate Center.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jill will be kicking us off.
Today's workshop, there are 4 of us from our so-called ebook detective agency, and you saw us in action a moment ago, and there we are frozen in time. But I also want to show off the logo created for the Minneries ebook detective agency, created by Elvis, and we wanted something that suggested the sort of the magnifying glass and Sherlock Holmes nature of detective work. Okay, so how did this all start? Well, like any good detective, we should retrace our steps. And in fact, I did that by going back and looking at the transcripts from our chat questions last night, because that's what I needed to do in order to retrace our steps. So on March 15th, the Graduate Center Library closed. As it was for many of you, I'm sure it was quite sudden. We knew changes were coming, but we had still, frankly, been talking about things like hand sanitizer, and then we shut, and we were not fully prepared for it. And so in the first wave of questions that came after that announcement were a lot of questions like, is the library open today? Is the library open tomorrow? Are any of the other CUNY libraries open? Can I return my books? Can I renew my books? It was a lot of questions about the physical space and physical items with respect to the physical space. But as soon as those questions died down, as soon as the messaging kind of got out that we were shut for the foreseeable future, then a second wave of questions started. And those were primarily of the form, can I get an electronic copy of this book? And sometimes it was a book that we owned physically, and sometimes it was a book we didn't own physically. Sometimes it was a book we had electronically already. They just didn't know that. But there was a lot of interest in getting electronic copies of books. And these inquiries were coming in a lot of ways, via chat reference, through interlibrary loan requests, as purchase requests to the collections department. And so in fact, the Associate Librarian for Collections and I had an exchange where we realized, okay, there has to be a systematic way to handle these requests. And how should we do it, and who should do it? And the answer emerged, very quickly and naturally, that it should be reference that handled these requests. But there were some real questions about how we would actually make that happen, and if it could be done using the mechanisms we already had, or if we needed to create new mechanisms. Kate, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so we decided to hang out our shingle as the ebook detective agency. And pretty quickly, on March 23rd, only 8 days after we originally shut, I asked 2 of our adjunct reference librarians to serve as ebook detectives to create a workflow for gathering these requests and for processing the requests, and to draft email templates that could be sent with a minimum of effort having to go into writing individual emails, because people could just use the templates. And that those 2 initial ebook detectives were Donna Davey, who is in attendance today but not presenting, and Catherine Pratt, and they did a great job. But actually, there was so much demand that it wasn't really possible for just 2 people to keep up. So we added another 2 detectives to the agency. And those next 2 detectives were Kate Angell, presenting with us today, and me. And then it turns out we still needed more help. And so then we trained 2 interlibrary loan assistants to do an initial assessment of requests. We wanted to make sure that a final check would still be done by reference librarians, and that the emails to patrons would go from the reference librarians, but that the ILL assistants could do some work behind the scenes to inform us about what they found, and then we could double check that or do some additional investigation before emailing patrons. And then one more person was added to the ebook detective agency, sort of as part of a job shift, Elvis went from being an adjunct reference librarian to our substitute head of reference, but then also there were some major projects Elvis was involved in. And as those kind of wound down, then Elvis had the bandwidth to participate in this operation as well. So at the end of the day, we have 7 ebook sleuths, and I have them listed on the bottom of the screen, and I have them all highlighted as well. And were highlighted in the colors that we use in our spreadsheet where we track things. And so one of the ways we can communicate with each other is highlighting certain lines in our colors so that people know that we have claimed them. And so even if we don't have any information there yet about where we've looked or what we found, just by highlighting the lines, we can indicate I'm on it. You know, I'm working on this one. Go choose a different one to work on. So those highlighting colors have come in very handy. Okay, next slide, Kate. Okay, and so in some ways, this is the heart of the detective agency, the ebook search request form. And this was something that Catherine and Donna created. And basically it gets basic information about the patron and as much information as they can provide about the book they want, including information about the edition, because sometimes it makes a difference if it's a specific edition. And we also ask them if they have the information to give us any information they might have about whether the book is available as an ebook, whether it's a book that we have in print, etc. And sometimes there are some important clues that can give us a little bit of a head start by some initial information that they provide us. And so this is a Google form, and so therefore all of the requests populate a Google spreadsheet, and that's where we work, highlighting the different rows in our different colors and adding notes in that spreadsheet in preparation for emailing the patrons with our findings. Okay, next slide. And over to Elvis.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think one of the interesting parts of this project is the tension between doing the work on the back end as detectives and then also wanting to empower patrons to be able to do some of that work potentially, or just kind of explore the ebook options themselves. So what you're seeing on the screen is a research guide that was created by Adriana Palmer, who's here with us today, and kind of maybe speak more about why this was originally created, but just to have something that shows where the ebooks are in terms of our own collections already, and then adding to that, which you can't see on the screen, but little carrots that say trial next to a lot of the new offerings that major publishers have made available recently as a kind of temporary access, but definitely wanting to note to patrons there's a limit to that access and it may not maintain for the foreseeable future post-COVID, but kind of just having that as part of the communication. Next slide. Yeah, so a little bit of that communication was done through blog posts. So this is one initial one by Donna Davey, who again was one of the primary and first detectives on the scene. Just kind of letting folks know that there are tips and tricks if they wanted to go out and themselves do this work. And just kind of, I think, making more visible what's happening on the back end. We know the little hoops that we're jumping through as librarians to find these ebooks in different sources and locations, but just kind of contextualizing why this is important right now and kind of politicizing ebooks and what they really represent in terms of scholarly publishing at large. So next slide. And yeah, so along with a couple of additional blog posts that went out by myself and Donna Davey and Catherine Pratt recently wrote one about the Open Library through the Internet Archive and kind of all of the politics and complexities of that, we wanted to still make it even more accessible for patrons if they, really just wanted to understand what was happening in the detective agency. So this was a slide from a workshop that was presented by Donna Davey and Catherine Pratt, finding ebook access in a shifting world. Where is my book, if my book is there at all? So I think just really getting into the nuance and nooks and crannies of where are ebooks, why can't I get my ebook, and how do I then access the ones that are out there, and in what format are they available currently? So next slide, and I think I'll pass it along next, back to Kate. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Elvis. So now I'll be talking a bit about the process of searching for these ebooks. On the screen right now is the first 2 of 11 total steps that we have in this shared document. These steps define the process for actually hunting down the ebooks. The steps were collaborative between reference, e-resources, and scholarly communication librarians. It's extremely helpful because it's essentially our roadmap for being able to have a shared process and also shared documents for locating these books. The first step here is to check to see if our library has the ebook, and if not, after that, the additional steps list different major resources that we subscribe to, such as JSTOR, HathiTrust, but then we also had different other resources that were open to everybody, including the NYPL and the National Emergency Library. We had 3 primary shared documents that we all worked with. One with these steps with the resources. Another is the document that Jill had referenced that tracked all the submissions from the patrons of the ebooks. And the other was a document, templates that Donna had created for different emails that we all could use as basis for responding to each patron individually. And this right here, this is part of onboarding that Jill had used with working with the 2 ILL assistants. This is very helpful because this is a practical activity for people who are coming on board, who are joining the detective agency. So this might be something that if you choose to replicate this type of program at your library and you want to bring anyone on board, whether that be student assistants or staff assistants, it can be helpful for onboarding people as well. And for the 2 ILL assistants, they typically do a preliminary search and provide a recommendation, and then a librarian would go back and check and complete and contact the patron with the results of the search. After I check the CUNY catalog, the first place that I always go is to WorldCat. It's basically my best friend in this because not only does it tell me if the book only exists in print, but it also sometimes provides direct links to free online ebooks. Typically through the Internet Archive and Open Library, both of which have been major sources for helping us to connect our patrons with free ebooks, especially with older ebooks. Also, the Google Books link can be helpful. I haven't yet found a full ebook on Google Books that our patrons have requested, but occasionally I found sizable free preview access, 70 or more pages, and this can be helpful because sometimes our patrons will report that they don't necessarily need a whole ebook, but that they just want a specific chapter, or sometimes even really just the table of contents or the references. This is part of a page from our ebooks guide. So it's a screenshot of some of the links of different publisher resources that we've been using, as well as the 2 icons for the ebook platforms, Bread's Shelf and VitalSource. So between March and the end of the semester in May, both of these companies had made many titles freely available to students. And so they were extremely useful because we were able to connect quite a few patrons with free books from Red Shelf and VitalSource, although they're not currently offering that service right now. HathiTrust, we are the Graduate Center. I believe we're the only member of the CUNY system for HathiTrust. It's been extremely helpful for us because they have offered emergency temporary access to member patrons, in which they can allow lawful access to materials in the HathiTrust that correspond to physical books that we own. So we've also been able to find quite a few books in here. According to one of our e-resources librarians, we have about 50% of our print collection is in the HathiTrust. One thing to note about this is that this is not in our catalog, so we always have to search specifically within HathiTrust itself every time we want to search for an ebook. I also want to bring up the National Emergency Library. You may have used this yourselves, part of the Internet Archive. It had provided emergency temporary access to a lot of different books. It was scheduled originally to shut down on June 30th, but it shut down a couple weeks early due to pressure from publishers and authors about copyright. It's still worth checking the Internet Archive for books. People can still borrow over 1 million books one at a time. We found a lot of ebooks through patrons through the Internet Archive. I also want to give a special shout out to NYPL because anyone who lives, attends school, or works in New York State can actually get a digital NYPL card via their ebook reader, Simply E. I hadn't heard of Simply E before the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's been so useful to our patrons because with it, they've been able to download this app, get access to a digital NYPL card if they didn't have one previously, and we've been able to connect them with many, not just ebooks, but also many audiobooks as well through Simply E. So I have some tips here. If an ebook access is not really available for a patron that we have collaboratively devised, one, our interlibrary loan department is still up and running for book chapters and journal articles. So we have encouraged patrons, if we were not able to track down an ebook for them, we've encouraged them to place interlibrary loan requests for chapters. We've also checked the digital library Scribd. We're also Amazon Audible for books for patrons. Scribd does a free 30-day trial, and we've used that. I've used that with quite a bit of success to connect patrons with books that I wasn't able to find on any of our library platforms or any other sources on the open internet. So if they create an account, they can get ebooks for free for 30 days. Amazon Audible gives you your first ebook free. In some cases, we have encouraged the patron to contact the author directly to try to see if the author would be able to provide them with free access or even some sort of draft, and then to check to see if the book is based on an available dissertation or thesis, either in an institutional repository or through one of our ProQuest dissertation databases. We have some tips for starting your own detective agency. The first would be definitely to identify partner departments. So this was a deeply collaborative project at the Graduate Center, as we've spoken about, between reference, scholarly communication, e-resources, and interlibrary loan. So we've all been able to work together and really have had some great success for our patrons with this. It's also really helpful to create specific search steps. If we had those 11 steps, share them with everybody who's going to be participating, and create a list of internal and external resources so that everybody who's working on the project will know all the different databases and websites outside of the library. The shared documents are major, so having a shared response tracking spreadsheet. Jill had mentioned the color coding for each detective has their own color so that we're not accidentally looking for the same book at the same time. That's been really useful to help us organize our the books and also our responses. The email templates that Donna had created saved a lot of time because then other detectives were just able to copy and paste and tweak the emails. And then promoting. We've promoted this on our website. We have on our Twitter account. As Elvis had mentioned, Donna and Catherine had done ebook workshops, and then sending this out via teaching faculty liaison relationships is also very helpful. And I should note also that every patron that submitted a request, we would use these email templates and send them out to them. And it would always be, if we couldn't find a specific book, we would always note to them that this permissions for ebooks are always changing and that we can come back and do a search in the future for them. Okay, and with that, I will pass the baton along to Adriana.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
So during our school's transition to a fully remote teaching and learning environment, the library worked really hard to amplify our existing online services, resources, and resource sharing networks, as we've described so far. At the same time, as many of you probably also experienced, our inboxes were flooded with announcements from vendors about all the ways they were, quote, opening, end quote, access to parts or all of their collections to us, with the intent to support research and pedagogy during the pandemic, in their words. The offerings varied wildly. Some were for COVID-specific research, some were specifically for textbooks, some were truly open access resources, while others required we provide our IP addresses or even employ methods of authentication that we don't normally use at our institution. There were offers that were not even pitched to the libraries, but rather to individual researchers, teachers, and students who would each need to individually secure their own access. So during this time, the aggregated lists that were created by librarians became very helpful in tracking all of these access changes that were being advertised during this time. Examples are publisher access changes, COVID-19, curated by folks at Bryant University Library in Rhode Island, and the vendor love in the time of COVID-19 by the University Information Policy Officers at Indiana U. Other efforts outside of libraries included the Public Books Database by Public Books Magazine and the Association of University Presses Open Up Socially Distancing collaboration. There were many, many such efforts, and even tracking and collating that information locally was kind of a big project. So the first step, if we go to the next slide, the first step really was deciding which of these resources we were even going to select or prioritize in the first place, because we ideally didn't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on resources that we wouldn't normally consider for trial, evaluation, and acquisition. Then we also had to decide where we wanted to show these resources within our library discovery system. We tried to focus on offers of resources that were truly open with no authentication required, or expansions of our existing subscriptions. So hopefully we wouldn't have any extra setup on our part. We definitely tried to prioritize content that was being offered versus infrastructure, particularly ebook content, which is the subject today. But we didn't want to we didn't want to point to resources that had ebooks with too many restrictions, too many use restrictions on them. And then another consideration was we wanted to deal with vendors who offered clear terms with regard to the duration of this temporary access, how to participate in the offer or activate the resource, and especially ones that didn't require any commitment to buy when the trial ended. So we decided that the accessible during COVID-19 resources would be added to the A to Z database list and our existing ebook collections guide, which was mentioned. And that guide is actually originally authored by our head of collections, Alicia Selly. We have had that guide for a while now to help people locate ebooks that for one reason or another hadn't been part of our Primo discovery in our Library OneSearch tool, or couldn't be activated in our other knowledge bases. And so for ebooks that had to be found directly in databases, it was helpful to have them collected in a guide. For the COVID-19 resources, we used the trial feature in LibGuides as much as possible so that the temporary assets would be removed automatically at the end of the trials for us. And we used some scripts to create widgets that would auto-populate the boxes on that ebook research guide when we added the database assets for the resources. So we tried to automate wherever we could. And I think on this slide, you can see we had to think carefully about how we wanted to describe the resources. And part of that was making sure we put temporary access during COVID-19 in the both the name and the description for the database, just so people could distinguish that from our regular offerings at the library. So the next slide. We relied heavily on that A to Z list and the ebook collections guide. But we decided ultimately not to, quote, turn on the resources everywhere, both to manage expectations about the library's ability to acquire everything that is currently on offer, but also to reduce some of the cleanup needed at the end of all of these trials. We're also, an important consideration is that we're part of a consortium at CUNY, and some of our knowledge bases are activated centrally. And our institution happens to be in the midst of a major migration project. So this decision was also in deference to existing workloads of colleagues who help us with those work orders. And I just added a link to a blog post that I thought was helpful during this time that was recommended to me, just speaking on that the need to balance the additional workload of ingesting all of these trials with the mission and the values of our library. Because these trials will end, and eventually we still need to continue to help our patrons navigate the online ebooks. But the good news is that the ebook detective skills work whether or not you have an abundance of trial access to resources. The request fulfillment rate might be lower in the latter case, but the skills you employ and also teach along the way will still turn up items that patrons might not find otherwise on their own. And I think that's a good segue for our next segment with Jill.
Before I cover some of our statistics, I just wanted to mention that while Kate and Elvis and Adriana were talking, I pasted into the chat a bunch of links to the things that we were mentioning. So in case you want to investigate how we did things a little bit more closely, there's a link to our request form, to our ebook collections guide, to 3 different blog posts that we did about ebooks and finding ebooks and the ebook detective agency, and then also to the blog post that's not by us that that Adriana just mentioned about free for COVID-19 and resource management. So I just wanted to make you all aware that they're there. But now I want to talk a little bit about various stats that we were able to collect based on how we did things and how we kept records. So As of June 18th, we had received 532 ebook search requests. Most of them, 429 of them, came in via that ebook search request form. And then another 103 came in either via chat or email, and then we logged those in a separate spreadsheet. And so what was our success rate like? It was, in all honesty, pretty good. We were able to meet the patron's need 271 out of those 532 times. So that's a success rate of just slightly over 50%. We weren't successful 253 of the 532 times. So around 47, 48% of the time we weren't successful. One thing that was very interesting though is in response to the emails that we sent patrons, and those were always individual, personal emails, we got an incredible amount of positive feedback and expressions of gratefulness and relief and joy at us being able to find the books they were interested in. But we also got an incredible number of thank you emails, even from those who we couldn't find the books for, because they understood that we put a lot of work into it. They were really grateful to have this service. Sometimes they'd indicated that's what they thought, but they just wanted to be sure. But so it was really nice to know that even when we couldn't meet their immediate need, it made them understand what we as librarians can do for them and how we can help them even more. And then 8 times, about 1.5% of the time, we maybe met their need. We weren't quite sure. Sometimes this was because we found a different edition than the one they specifically requested. Sometimes it's because we found the dissertation on which the book was based. Sometimes it's because we found, maybe they needed 2 chapters and we were able to find the vast majority of those 2 chapters available through a combination of Google Books and Amazon Search Inside the Book. And we weren't quite sure if that fully met their need or not. So sometimes we were able to turn one of those maybes into a yes based on how they responded to us, letting us know that it did in fact satisfy their need. But sometimes it's just an open question. We don't really know if it provided them with the information they needed. Okay, Kate, on to the next. So our next set of stats is the time per investigation. And so we didn't keep track of the time all the way through since the beginning, but a few weeks in, we decided to start keeping track of, approximately how much time we spent on each search. We weren't actually timing ourselves with a stopwatch, but we had a sense at the end. Did we spend 5 minutes? Did we spend 10 minutes, etc.? And then we would log that time. And the individual times ranged from 2 minutes to 60 minutes. And I can say I was the person who did the 60-minute one, and that was a really, really complicated one. And I almost gave up several times, but I wasn't convinced it couldn't be found, so I kept going, and I did eventually find it. And the reason that one was so complicated was because they submitted something that was a German language text, and they wanted to know if we had an English translation of it. And but it wasn't quite as simple as that, because it turns out that the German version of the text was actually a translation from Middle English. So then there is the question of, was that Middle English text translated to Modern English? And the answer was yes, but not as a volume in and of itself, but it could be found inside another volume. So, right. I almost gave up, but I'm really glad that I didn't, because it was satisfying to be able to give the patron what they needed, but also just really satisfying to know that if you dive in really deep, sometimes you can find things in places where you don't expect them. Okay, but those are the individual times. The average time per search was 12 minutes and 45 seconds. Again, maybe that's overly precise because we weren't actually precisely timing our times. We tended to just, estimate and round to the nearest minute. So with apologies for the illusion of precision where maybe it's not warranted. The average time per successful search was 8 minutes and 22 seconds. So that's considerably lower than the average time. And that's because the average time per unsuccessful search was 17 minutes and 46 seconds, almost 10 minutes longer than the time per successful search. And that really stands out, but it's very understandable. When you're searching and you have success, you know that you can stop then. You know that you found the thing you needed, and you've succeeded, and you can email the patron and you're done. If you're unsuccessful, it's sometimes hard to know where to stop. And you can keep going and going, or rechecking your search in a different way. For example, we found out that in some of our tools, like in the Internet Archive, it does very badly with subtitles. And so if you search with the title : the subtitle, it would very often not find it. But if you search just for the title, it very often would find it. And so I know I would cycle back around and retry my searches in a variety of different ways. And then at some point you have to decide, okay, I've tried everything on our list. I've tried everything I can think of. I've Googled creatively. I'm done. But it is hard to know exactly when to draw that line. And then the average time for requests where the need was maybe met was 15 minutes. And so that's closer to the unsuccessful searches. And again, it's because, well, maybe I found this thing that sort of gets them there, but can I keep searching to find something that really gets us to success? And so those searches tended to take longer as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, and the number of patrons helped. So the request form was used 429 times by 199 different patrons. So the average number of requests per patron was 2.2 requests. However, that is somewhat misleading because some users were very heavy users of the form. And it could be for all sorts of reasons. For example, I heard specifically from somebody who used the form multiple times that he was preparing for comprehensive exams, like his oral exams for his program. And so there were a lot of books he needed to be able to find in the lead up to that. And so his desire for those books, but actually also his actual need for those books was pretty high. So the most requests by a single user was 24, and that was definitely an outlier, but there were other people who used the form quite heavily. Our runners-up asked for searches 13 times, 10 times, and 8 times. And we don't have similar stats for the requests that were made by chat or email because we weren't tracking who specifically was making those requests. So these are just the requests that came in via the form. Okay, next slide. And back to Elvis.
Indeed, hello. Yeah, so I'm going to kind of slightly pivot. I just dropped a few links in a chat just for context in our transition to kind of the post-COVID and COVID experience of libraries. We were also developing a symposium that was related to the Open Pedagogy Fellowship. So the fellowship was something that involved 14 doctoral students who applied to this program through the library, and this was funded by the state OER funding. So essentially OER, meaning Open Educational Resources, kind of in the same general umbrella of access and kind of reusing content and making materials freely available to students. So within the fellowship, the fellows were tasked to basically take their syllabus and convert it to openly licensed materials and create a course site so they could have students access those materials on the CUNY Academic Commons, which is the open platform that CUNY uses for this purpose. And I think the reason that it kind of fits into this is because ebooks, I think, are more kind of commonly accessible within the public library realm, potentially, but in scholarly use in academic libraries, the urgency that was suddenly put upon us to really use ebooks and find them intensified during COVID. So suddenly, obviously, the print and physical books are not available, and it kind of is parallel to the task the fellows had of where can I find either a textbook or a novel or a full accessible piece of content that I can actually teach a course around. So in a kind of similar universe, they found a lot of different creative strategies to do this. One interesting one was someone who found an audiobook that they liked, an audio version of a textbook, and basically chose to integrate that into their course as the primary text, even though it could only be listened to. So I'm not sure about the accessibility thoughts on that, but I thought it was an interesting strategy of I found the content, but it's only an audiobook. So all of these complications that scholars and teachers are constantly kind of weaving through because the content just is not totally open. A lot of similar projects used Project Gutenberg. There's a project at CUNY called Manifold, which is basically a platform where you can ingest the text and kind of make it more annotatable, something you can really interact with. and use it in a more social way. So there's a lot of different strategies for once you have that content in an ebook format of some type, to then reuse it. And so that's kind of the project of OER, which I think is a parallel universe in this sense. And finally, there are a lot of OER textbooks that are out there that you can, in some cases, order online and send to yourself as a printed out textbook, like a just classic physical book. So I think this whole transition is very fluid and kind of an interesting similar umbrella. Next slide. And just to kind of recap and tie that together with this project, I think just the symposium that we held on April 24th, it was originally, of course, supposed to be in person. So suddenly we converted it to being online, and it was this kind of intensive 5-hour events. We had a lot of great speakers from within and without CUNY. Audrey Waters, who writes a lot about educational technology and the commercialization of that, and of course, ebooks are part of that kind of question mark, spoke about, and I put her transcript into the chat, just to kind of get a sense of this future of what does open look like, and what do all of these complications and commercialized kind of intersections really mean. So that's kind of the tensions of open and closed a little bit that I wanted to speak on. And someone asked in the chat, what does it mean to ingest a text? So I just thought I would really quickly clarify. That's the term that they use with the Manifold platform, and I'll just put a link in the chat. It basically takes the text that you have, and there's ways that you can modify it so that you can do social annotations on top of the text. So they kind of float in the margins. So it's kind of like just uploading a full text, usually it could be a complete book, or you can create anthologies. Just a side note, not an ebook, directly ebook project, but being able to use text in different ways, I think, is something that is coming up frequently and is discussed a lot within that context.
Thanks so much, everyone.